In the first week of January 1709, an extraordinary Arctic cold fell over the Kingdom of France. Across Western Europe, temperatures collapsed over 48 hours. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, rivers froze solid. Off the port of Marseille, ice formed along the saltwater coast, trapping merchant vessels in harbour. Yet nowhere was the shock of this climate catastrophe felt with more striking clarity than within the stone walls of Versailles. At the centre of this world sat Louis XIV, the Sun King, now 70 years old and in the 46th year of his personal reign. For decades, Versailles had been engineered as a showcase of royal power and order. Yet in those opening days of January, the cold penetrated the great palace. Inside the Hall of Mirrors and the royal apartments, hearths were stocked with wood day and night, but the draughty, vaulted spaces remained bitterly cold. Madame de Maintenon and the king's ministers wrote in their letters of cold so intense that liquid froze in glasses on dining tables. In unheated antechambers, ink froze in inkwells on state desks, interrupting official correspondence. Outside the palace, beyond the silent canals of the royal gardens, the winter of 1709 was disrupting French society. This was Le Grand Hiver, the Great Frost, a climate event of extreme severity. Across the northern provinces of Normandy, Picardy, and the Ile-de-France, as well as down the Loire Valley, deep frost penetrated the ground. The winter wheat, planted the previous autumn, had not yet developed a protective cover of snow in many regions when the Arctic wind arrived. Across vast stretches of farmland, the seed died in the frozen earth. Olive trees in Provence and old vineyards in central France suffered catastrophic frost damage, their wood splitting open as the moisture inside them froze. Livestock perished in unheated barns and pastures across rural districts. For regular listeners of our journey, this is the same severe Arctic winter that descended upon Eastern Europe during the campaign of 1708 and 1709, the frost that paralyzed military operations in Ukraine and tested Charles XII's Swedish army before the Battle of Poltava. But while that winter shaped military campaigns in the east, its western reach brought severe agricultural disruption to the most populous state in Western Europe. By February, as low temperatures persisted, agricultural disruption turned into widespread food scarcity. In Paris, the price of bread rose dramatically, far exceeding what an ordinary labouring family could afford. Municipal authorities struggled to regulate grain supplies, and crowds gathered outside bakeries demanding bread at fixed prices. In rural parishes, where the vast majority of the population lived, the situation became precarious. Parish priests, recording burials in local registers, documented a steady rise in mortality. They recorded deaths from exposure in unheated homes and described impoverished villagers gathering wild roots, acorns, and edible herbs from the fields to survive. In some districts, contemporary accounts noted people consuming boiled tree bark and wild grasses when grain stores failed. As spring arrived, the thaw confirmed widespread crop failure. The autumn-sown grain was largely lost, ensuring that the summer harvest of 1709 would yield only a fraction of normal output. Over the following 18 months, demographic historians estimate that between 600,000 and 1 million French subjects died, a combination of cold, malnutrition, and infectious diseases such as typhus and dysentery that spread rapidly among weakened populations. What made Le Grand Hiver particularly dangerous for the French crown was that it did not occur in isolation. It struck a kingdom already heavily burdened by 8 years of continuous warfare. The War of the Spanish Succession had dragged on since 1701, spanning theatres from Flanders and the Rhine to Italy, Spain, and North America. France was financially strained and facing a formidable coalition of European powers. The winter also revealed something less dramatic, but equally important about early 18th century government. A monarchy could command armies across Europe and still remain vulnerable to the weather at home. Orders from Versailles could move along the royal post roads, tax officials could demand payment, and intendants could report shortages, but none of those instruments could make grain appear where harvests had failed. Relief depended on local stores, merchants willing to move food, passable roads, municipal regulation, private charity, and the ability of households to endure until another crop could be gathered. The crisis therefore measured the reach of royal power against the stubborn limits of transport, climate, and subsistence. For Louis XIV, that contrast mattered. The state that had built fortresses, maintained armies, and projected French influence from the Rhine to Spain now confronted a danger that could not be defeated in battle. The Great Frost did not end the war, but it changed the scale on which every decision had to be judged. A campaign that might once have been measured in fortresses captured or provinces defended now had to be weighed against empty granaries, declining tax receipts, and a population already carrying the accumulated burden of years of conflict. As Louis XIV observed the crisis from Versailles, his administration faced difficult choices. The capacity of the state was stretched to its limit. The priority moved from pursuing territorial expansion to stabilizing the realm and preserving the state. To secure stability, France would need to enter diplomatic negotiations to end the war. But as events would show, concluding a multi-theater conflict among competing global powers required navigating complex geopolitical demands. By the spring of 1709, the physical devastation wrought by the Great Frost was intersecting with a systemic financial crisis that threatened to collapse the French monarchy from within. For nearly 8 years, France had been attempting to fund a multi-front continental war while simultaneously maintaining naval squadrons in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The machinery of early modern state finance, built largely on credit, indirect taxation, and short-term loans, was buckling under the weight of unprecedented expenditure. The financial administration of the realm rested in the hands of Nicolas Desmarets, whom Louis XIV had appointed as Comptroller General of Finances in February 1708. Desmarets, a nephew of the legendary royal minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, inherited a royal treasury that was functionally empty. The crown's future tax revenues had already been mortgaged years in advance to private financiers and syndicate tax farmers. Credit was so severely compromised that the royal treasury had resorted to issuing short-term promissory notes known as billets de monnaie, which traded on the open market at discounts of 70 to 80% below their face value. As the agricultural collapse of 1709 eliminated the peasantry's capacity to pay the taille, the kingdom's direct land tax, Desmarets was forced to implement emergency measures to keep the state solvent. The Comptroller General appealed directly to the wealthiest banking houses in Paris, Lyon, and Geneva, securing high-interest loans by offering royal jewels and crown lands as collateral. To produce immediate specie, Louis XIV ordered the melting down of the royal gold and silver plate at the Mint. The heavy, ornate silver furniture that had long decorated the state apartments at Versailles, tables, mirrors, candelabras, and benches, was broken down and converted into coin. The king issued a royal decree encouraging the nobility and church prelates to follow his example. Courtiers brought their family silver to the Mint, receiving paper receipts in return, and dined off porcelain or earthenware plates. Saint-Simon noted in his memoirs that while this sacrifice yielded several million livres, it was a drop of water in an ocean of state debt, serving primarily as a public demonstration of royal austerity. Beyond the court, the collapse of agricultural production created an immediate crisis of social order. In early modern France, bread was not merely a dietary staple, it represented upwards of 70% of the daily caloric intake for working families. When the frost destroyed the autumn wheat, the price of grain soared. In Paris, the cost of a standard 4-pound loaf of bread rose from its normal price of 3 or 4 sous to over 30 sous by mid-1709. For an urban day labourer or artisan, whose daily wage rarely exceeded 15 to 20 sous, purchasing adequate bread for a household became mathematically impossible. The resulting hunger triggered widespread unrest across major urban centres. Bread riots erupted in Paris, Rouen, Tours, and Marseille. Grain barges travelling along the Seine and Loire rivers were intercepted and looted by armed crowds. In Paris, crowds gathered outside the bakery of the Grand Châtelet and surrounded the residences of royal officials, chanting for bread and peace. The Lieutenant General of Police, Marc-René de Voyer de Paulmy, Marquis d'Argenson, deployed the French guards to patrol the streets, maintain order around grain markets, and forcibly disperse public gatherings. D'Argenson recognized that force alone could not prevent a total insurrection. He established emergency public bakeries, fixed maximum grain prices, and organized municipal relief distribution funded by forced contributions levied on wealthy merchants and religious orders. In the countryside, where relief mechanisms were virtually non-existent, ordinary families were forced to adapt to extreme scarcity. Parish priory registers across Normandy, Anjou, and the Ile-de-France document a dramatic rise in vagrancy as tens of thousands of displaced peasants abandoned their frozen plots to search for food along the high roads. Priests recorded the burials of unknown travelers found along ditch banks and parish borders. Malnutrition compromised immune systems, allowing infectious diseases to sweep through vulnerable populations. Typhus, carried by lice among displaced crowds, and dysentery, spread through contaminated water sources, accounted for a substantial proportion of the mortality attributed to the crisis of 1709-1710. Modern historical demography confirms that the mortality spike was compounded by a severe collapse in the birth rate, as amenorrhea caused by starvation and a temporary cessation of marriages drastically reduced conception rates across the kingdom. While domestic collapse threatened the interior, France's military situation along her northern border reached a critical juncture in the summer of 1709. The Grand Alliance, led by the Grand Pensionary of Holland, Anthony Heinsius, the imperial commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy, and the British Captain General, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, believed that France was on the verge of total collapse. Sensing that the Sun King was helpless, the Allies presented Louis XIV with peace terms during negotiations at The Hague in the spring of 1709. The Allied demands, known as the Preliminary Articles, were uncompromising. They required France to cede her border fortresses, surrender her claims to the Spanish inheritance, and recognize the Protestant succession in Britain. But Article 37 contained a clause that Louis XIV found morally and politically impossible to accept. If Philip V refused to abdicate the Spanish throne within 2 months, French troops would be required to join forces with the Allied armies to forcibly expel Louis XIV's own grandson from Madrid. Louis XIV consulted his Council of State at Versailles. While his ministers were terrified of continuing a war without funds, the king concluded that if he must fight, he would rather fight his enemies than his own family. On June 12, 1709, the king took an unprecedented step in the history of his absolute monarchy. He issued an open letter addressed to his governors, bishops, and subjects. Read from parish pulpits and posted in market squares across the realm, the royal appeal outlined the harsh terms demanded by the Allies, explaining that he had offered immense concessions to secure peace, but that the enemy insisted on continuing the war to dismantle France itself. The letter appealed to the national honor and endurance of the French people, asking for a final effort to defend the fatherland. The king's public appeal generated an extraordinary surge of patriotic resolve and military enlistment. Thousands of starving young men joined the royal armies, where daily military bread rations, however meager and coarse, offered a higher chance of survival than remaining in ruined villages. Command of the main army in Flanders was entrusted to Marshal Claude Louis Hector de Villars, one of France's most energetic and charismatic military commanders. Villars rallied the troops, restored discipline, and constructed extensive field fortifications and defensive earthworks behind Vauban's existing northern fortress belt, the Pré Carré. On September 11, 1709, the opposing armies met near the village of Malplaquet, close to the modern border between France and Belgium. The Grand Alliance assembled approximately 86,000 troops under Marlborough and Prince Eugene, while Villars commanded roughly 75,000 French soldiers. Villars anchored his defensive line between 2 dense forests, the woods of Lanière and Saz, entrenching his infantry behind earthen redoubts, palisades, and abattis constructed from felled trees. The Battle of Malplaquet became the bloody, grinding climax of the Western European War. Marlborough and Prince Eugene launched a series of frontal infantry assaults against the fortified French positions. For over 6 hours, waves of Dutch, British, and Imperial infantry surged against the redoubts, meeting concentrated musket volleys and point-blank canister fire from French artillery batteries. The Dutch infantry, attacking the French right flank under the Prince of Orange, suffered catastrophic losses, losing over 5,000 men in less than 2 hours. Villars conducted a flexible, stubborn defense, counter-attacking whenever Allied columns breached the outer entrenchments. During a fierce struggle along the French centre, Villars was severely wounded in the knee by a musket ball and had to be carried unconscious from the field on a litter. command passed to the veteran Marshal Boufflers, who continued the defensive fight, realizing that his infantry reserves were exhausted and that the Allied cavalry had penetrated the centre. Boufflers ordered a controlled, orderly retreat toward the fortress of Valenciennes. The French army withdrew in good order, preserving its artillery and standards, leaving the battlefield to the Allies. Although Malplaquet was technically an Allied victory, as Marlborough and Prince Eugene held the field and subsequently captured the fortress of Mons, the tactical victory was purchased at an appalling human price. The Grand Alliance suffered over 20,000 casualties, including more than 5,000 dead. French casualties were roughly half that number, estimated between 10,000 and 11,000 men. Malplaquet was the bloodiest battle of the 18th century prior to the Napoleonic Wars. The psychological impact of Malplaquet was profound. When news of the casualty figures reached London and Amsterdam, public opinion was shattered. The Allied belief that France was on the verge of military annihilation vanished overnight. Villars famously wrote to Louis XIV from his sickbed, "If God gives us the grace to lose another such battle, Your Majesty can count upon his enemies being destroyed." The French army remained intact, its defensive lines held, and the Allies were forced to realize that penetrating the heart of France would require an unthinkable sacrifice in blood and treasure. While grand armies clashed on the fields of Flanders, the war was simultaneously reverberating across the Atlantic in the North American colonies, where the conflict was known as Queen Anne's War. This colonial theatre was not characterized by massive infantry engagements or formal siege warfare, but by a brutal, low-intensity war of attrition fought across vast, forested frontiers and coastal waterways. In North America, the conflict pitted English settlers in New England, New York, and Carolina against French colonists in New France, Canada, and Acadia, along with Spanish forces in Florida. Both European powers forged crucial military alliances with Native American nations. The French relied heavily on indigenous allies, including the Wabanaki Confederacy, Huron, and Catholic Iroquois living along the St. Lawrence, to launch winter raids against vulnerable English frontier settlements. These raids were designed to strike terror, secure captives, and disrupt English expansion. One of the most prominent events of this frontier conflict occurred earlier in the war at Deerfield, Massachusetts, in February 1704, where a joint French and Abenaki force attacked the outpost, killing 56 settlers and taking over 100 captives on a grueling winter march to Canada. Similar skirmishes and counter-raids continued throughout the 1709-1710 period along the borders of Maine, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. Frontier families lived in constant insecurity, sleeping in fortified garrison houses with loaded muskets, while farmlands along the frontier were periodically abandoned. Further south, in North and South Carolina, colonial authorities engaged in fierce rivalries with Spanish outposts in St. Augustine and Spanish-aligned native nations. English trade expansion and land encroachment triggered escalating regional tensions. The Tuscarora War, which would erupt in North Carolina in 1711, had its direct origins in these years of trade abuses, land seizures, and the enslavement of native people by colonial traders. Similarly, South Carolina's aggressive expansion set the stage for the Yamasee War of 1715. The strategic centerpiece of the Northern Colonial War was control of Acadia and the sea approaches to the St. Lawrence River. Acadia, situated on the northeastern Atlantic coast, occupied a vital strategic position overlooking the rich cod fisheries of the Grand Banks and the sea lanes connecting Britain to her American colonies. The French stronghold at Port Royal served as a base for French privateers, who preyed upon New England merchant vessels and fishing fleets, inflicting severe commercial losses on Boston merchants. In October 1710, a combined British and New England colonial expedition set sail to capture Port Royal. The force consisted of 5 British warships and over 2,000 colonial provincial troops from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, commanded by Colonel Francis Nicholson. The French garrison at Port Royal, under the command of Daniel d'Augicourt de Subercaz, was chronically undersupplied, short of gunpowder, and defended by fewer than 300 soldiers. Nicholson landed his troops, established siege batteries, and began a bombardment of the fort. Subercaz, recognizing that no reinforcements or supplies could be expected from war-weary France, surrendered the post on October 16, 1710, after a brief siege. Nicholson renamed the outpost Annapolis Royal in honor of Queen Anne, and Britain formally claimed possession of Peninsular Acadia, renaming it Nova Scotia. The fall of Port Royal was a significant regional shift in North America. It provided Britain with a permanent strategic foothold in eastern Canada, reduced the immediate threat of French privateering against New England shipping, and demonstrated that Britain's growing naval power could effectively project force into the Atlantic world. Yet, like the bloody stalemate at Malplaquet, the colonial struggles in North America underscored a larger reality. The war had grown too vast, too expensive, and too destructive for any single power to win a decisive, total victory on the battlefield. The future of North America, like the future of Europe, would not be decided by local garrisons or frontier skirmishes, but by the diplomatic calculations of exhausted statesmen meeting in the quiet conference rooms of Europe. To understand how the French monarchy survived the dual shocks of agricultural ruin and bankruptcy, one must examine the intricate, high-stakes financial maneuvers engineered by Nicolas Desmarets during the darkest months of 1709 and 1710. The fundamental dilemma facing the Comptroller General was that the traditional apparatus of royal taxation had effectively collapsed. The taille, which generated the bulk of direct royal revenue from the rural peasantry, could not be collected in districts where whole villages were subsisting on charity or wild roots. Meanwhile, the gabelle, the royal monopoly tax on salt, saw its revenues plummet as trade along provincial highways halted. Desmarets realized that the state could no longer rely on conventional tax collection. It required an immediate, massive infusion of liquidity to pay army officers, purchase grain from foreign neutrals, and maintain basic public administration. To achieve this, he turned to the traitants and partisans, wealthy private tax farming syndicates who routinely advanced short-term loans to the crown in exchange for the future right to collect specific provincial duties. By offering extraordinary interest rates and mortgaging royal forest timber rights years into the future, Desmarets persuaded these syndicates to keep military supply lines open. Simultaneously, Desmarets engineered a crucial arrangement with the Swiss banking houses of Geneva and the powerful Huguenot merchant financiers of Lyon. Despite royal religious edicts that had expelled Protestants from France decades earlier, financial necessity bridged the sectarian divide. Protestant bankers, operating through international commercial networks spanning Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, provided bills of exchange that allowed the French crown to purchase grain shipments secretly from neutral Baltic ports and Swedish territories. To absorb the vast ocean of depreciated royal paper, Desmarets launched a daring monetary reform in late 1709, devaluing the silver livre and forcing holders of discounted billets de monnaie to convert them into new long-term state annuities. This maneuver did not erase the national debt, but it succeeded in stabilization, preventing total state bankruptcy and allowing the royal mints to issue fresh coin to supply Marshal Villars' armies along the northern frontier. Desmarets also searched for revenue beyond the ordinary taxes that were already failing under the pressure of famine. In 1710, the crown introduced the dixième, a wartime levy intended in principle to take 1/10 of income. The measure was significant because it reached toward forms of wealth that older direct taxes did not touch evenly. France remained a society of privileges, exemptions, negotiated obligations, and regional differences, so the tax did not operate as a modern universal income tax. Its assessment was uneven, collection could be contested, and powerful groups still found ways to reduce what they owed. Even so, the decision showed how far the fiscal emergency had pushed the monarchy. A government that had traditionally relied heavily on peasant taxation, indirect duties, offices, and borrowing was now trying to broaden the revenue base during a national crisis. The dixième did not solve the underlying problem. It provided money, but it also demonstrated that wartime finance had become a contest between immediate survival and future solvency. Every new loan carried interest. Every anticipated tax receipt reduced the revenue available in later years. Every office sold for cash today created obligations tomorrow. The monarchy survived by layering one expedient upon another, and Desmarets' achievement was less the restoration of healthy finances than the prevention of administrative collapse. There were signs of recovery in the countryside after the worst months of 1709, but they came slowly and unevenly. Spring sowing replaced some of the grain destroyed by the frost, and later harvests eased the immediate scarcity in portions of the kingdom. Yet a household that had sold tools, livestock, seed grain, or household goods to buy food could not simply return to its previous condition when prices fell. Villages had lost laborers, families had accumulated debts, fields had gone unattended, local charities had exhausted their reserves. The demographic shock lingered after the weather itself had moderated. That distinction helps explain why France could continue fighting even while the country was suffering so severely. The monarchy still possessed institutions capable of extracting resources, borrowing money, moving grain, and supplying armies. But those institutions were operating by transferring pressure downward and forward, onto taxpayers, creditors, local communities, and future revenues. France had not recovered its strength. It had found ways to remain standing. The effort to keep the army supplied imposed its own geography on the crisis. Grain, fodder, powder, clothing, horses, and replacement weapons had to move toward Flanders, even while civilians competed for many of the same transport animals and food stocks. Military magazines could not be filled simply by issuing an order from Versailles. Contractors had to purchase supplies, local officials had to assemble carts, and roads had to remain usable. When prices rose or credit failed, a delay in payment could become a delay in bread for a regiment. That logistical pressure helps explain why the monarchy treated finance and military survival as the same problem. A livre borrowed in Paris might become flour purchased in a provincial market, wages paid to a wagoner, or powder delivered to a fortress. The survival of Villiers' army depended on an administrative chain that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The necessity of maintaining these military forces became absolute following the total collapse of the Hague peace negotiations in May and June 1709. The diplomatic failure at The Hague was not merely a tragic breakdown of communication, it fundamentally reshaped French domestic politics. Prior to the talks, French public opinion was deeply fractured, and defeatism had penetrated the highest ranks of the court. Prince Eugene and the Duke of Marlborough believed that Louis XIV was so desperate that he would accept any terms, no matter how humiliating. When the Allied negotiators presented the preliminary articles, they demanded major French concessions, including key frontier positions and recognition of the Protestant succession in Britain. But Article 37 was the most politically explosive provision. If Philip V refused to surrender the Spanish crown within the specified period, Louis XIV would be expected to cooperate with Allied measures intended to remove his own grandson from the throne. When Louis XIV released his public appeal in June 1709, the harsh Allied terms helped generate an extraordinary surge of defensive resolve. The reaction was not uniform across a kingdom still suffering hunger and unrest, but the negotiations allowed the crown to present the continuing war as a defense of France against demands many subjects regarded as excessive. This political shift directly influenced the strategic outcome of Malplaquet in September 1709. On paper, Marlborough and Prince Eugene added another victory to their unbroken string of triumphs, which included Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. They held the blood-soaked field, captured the fortress of Mons, and forced the French army to retreat. Yet in the larger calculus of grand strategy, Malplaquet became a major political turning point for the Grand Alliance. Before Malplaquet, the British public and Parliament had willingly borne the soaring costs of the war, convinced by Marlborough's Whig allies that one final decisive blow would bring total victory and the unconditional surrender of France. Malplaquet shattered that illusion. The sight of 20,000 Allied casualties, including the near destruction of the elite Dutch blue-coated infantry, proved that the French army was far from beaten. In London, Tory pamphlets immediately seized upon the slaughter, accusing Marlborough of recklessly squandering British and Allied lives for personal ambition and Whig political power. The strategic reality was now stark. France possessed a deep defensive belt of fortresses, an intact army led by brilliant commanders like Villiers, and a population determined to resist dismemberment. For the Grand Alliance to force its way to Paris, it would have to fight a dozen more battles as bloody as Malplaquet, at a cost in lives and treasure that neither Britain nor the Dutch Republic could afford. By standing firm in the muddy woods of Flanders, the French army had successfully transformed a military crisis into a political stalemate, setting the stage for the dramatic political collapse of the Allied war coalition in the halls of Westminster. While the slaughter at Malplaquet and the famine of 1709 forced the French monarchy into a desperate defensive stance, the political landscape of its greatest adversary was undergoing a silent, fundamental transformation. In London, the domestic political consensus supporting the War of the Spanish Succession was fracturing under the weight of escalating taxation, mounting public debt, and growing suspicion regarding the ultimate war aims of Britain's continental allies. Between 1710 and 1711, a dramatic shift in parliamentary power would break the political stranglehold of the Whig war faction, elevate a Tory ministry committed to peace, and inaugurate a wave of secret diplomacy that altered the trajectory of European history. To understand the political collapse of Marlborough's coalition, one must examine the structure of British politics during the reign of Queen Anne. Since the outbreak of hostilities in 1702, the war effort had been directed by a formidable triumvirate: John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, who commanded the Allied forces in Flanders; Sidney Godolphin, the Lord High Treasurer, who managed state finances and parliamentary majorities; and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, who served as Queen Anne's closest confidant and mistress of the robes. Though Marlborough and Godolphin were moderate Tories by inclination, their absolute commitment to achieving a total military victory over Louis XIV forced them into an increasingly tight political alliance with the junto Whigs, a tightly organised faction of politicians who championed an uncompromising war policy, heavily supported by London's financial elites, the Bank of England, and the New East India Company. By 1709, this war coalition faced growing resentment across landowning British society. 8 years of continuous warfare had generated financial burdens without precedent in English history. To finance the vast subsidies paid to Imperial, Dutch, and German mercenary units, Parliament relied heavily on the land tax. At its wartime high rate of 4 shillings in the pound, the land tax placed a heavy burden on assessed landed wealth and fell squarely upon the country gentry, the traditional Tory base. While gentry landowners saw their estates burdened and their rents squeezed, they watched a new class of London financiers, government contractors, and stock jobbers grow wealthy by lending money to the state at high interest rates. The national debt, managed through the newly established Bank of England, had climbed toward £40 million, an astronomical sum for the era that many gentry feared would lead to national bankruptcy or the permanent subjugation of the landed interest to urban capital. This financial grievance was compounded by profound strategic frustration. The Allied slogan, "No peace without Spain," which insisted that Archduke Charles of Austria must be placed on the throne in Madrid and that Philip V must be completely expelled, seemed increasingly unachievable through military force. While Marlborough won brilliant, blood-soaked tactical victories in Flanders, the Allied campaigns inside Spain itself were plagued by disaster, poor coordination, and substantial support for Philip V across much of Castile and other regions outside the principal Habsburg strongholds. The British public began to view the war in Flanders not as a necessary defence of European liberties, but as an endless, costly siege campaign designed to expand the territorial border of the Dutch Republic while enriching Allied generals. The spark that ignited this latent discontent into an explosive political crisis occurred in November 1709 in the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral. Dr. Henry Sacheverell, a High Church Anglican clergyman, delivered a fiery sermon entitled "The Perils of False Brethren," in which he attacked the Whig administration, condemned religious toleration for Protestant dissenters, and asserted the doctrine of non-resistance to royal authority, implicitly challenging the legitimacy of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Lord Treasurer Godolphin and the Whig junto made the fatal strategic error of prosecuting Sacheverell for high crimes and misdemeanours before the House of Lords in early 1710. The trial became a national political sensation. Rather than suppressing high church Tory sentiment, the trial provided Sacheverell with a massive public platform. Rioting crowds marched through the streets of London, attacking dissenting meeting houses and chanting support for the Church and the Queen. When the House of Lords finally found Sacheverell guilty in March 1710, the outrage among Tory peers was so intense that the Lords imposed a nominal sentence, suspending him from preaching for 3 years and burning his sermon. the mild sentence was widely interpreted as a catastrophic moral and political defeat for Godolphin's ministry. Watching these developments with calculating precision was Robert Harley, a master parliamentary strategist and former Secretary of State who had been forced out of the cabinet by Marlborough and Godolphin in 1708. Harley recognized that Queen Anne was deeply wary of the Duchess of Marlborough's domineering presence, alarmed by the rise of religious radicalism, and desperate to end the bloodshed and financial drain of the war. Operating through his cousin Abigail Masham, who had replaced the Duchess of Marlborough as the Queen's favourite bedchamber companion, Harley secured private, late-night audiences with Queen Anne. He assured the Queen that a moderate government could be formed that would defend the Church of England, lower the land tax, and bring the European war to an honourable conclusion without collapsing public credit. In the summer of 1710, Queen Anne executed a systematic, piecemeal dismantling of the Whig administration. In June, she dismissed the Earl of Sunderland, a leading Whig junto member and Marlborough's son-in-law. In August, she delivered a decisive blow by dismissing Godolphin himself, breaking his staff of office as Lord Treasurer. Harley was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer and effective head of the new ministry, bringing into his cabinet Henry St. John, a brilliant, ambitious, and fiery young orator who assumed the critical post of Secretary of State for the Northern Department. To solidify their hold on power, Harley and St. John persuaded the Queen to dissolve Parliament and call a general election in the autumn of 1710. The election turned into a sweeping Tory landslide, capitalising on the public anger generated by the Sacheverell trial and widespread war weariness. Tory candidates swept the county constituencies, securing an overwhelming majority in the House of Commons. For the first time in nearly a decade, the British government was controlled by a ministry openly committed to dismantling the Whig war policy and seeking a negotiated peace with France. Yet, Harley and St. John faced a formidable challenge: how to dismantle a global war coalition without causing a collapse of public credit at home or provoking an immediate military intervention by Britain's allies. The Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire were terrified by the political shift in London. The Bank of England was controlled by Whig financiers who warned that removing Marlborough or abandoning the no peace without Spain doctrine would trigger a run on the bank and bankrupt the state. To reshape public opinion and dismantle the intellectual foundation of the Whig war effort, Harley turned to the power of the press. In the autumn of 1710, he recruited Jonathan Swift, the brilliant Anglo-Irish satirist, clergyman, and political writer. Swift was given access to inner cabinet councils, official documents, and intelligence reports, becoming the chief propagandist for the Tory ministry. Operating through the political journal The Examiner and a series of anonymous pamphlets, Swift launched an aggressive ideological campaign against the Whigs and the Grand Alliance. The climax of Swift's propaganda effort came in November 1711 with the publication of his masterpiece of political polemic, The Conduct of the Allies. Printed in massive quantities and sold for a few pence, the pamphlet became an immediate sensation, selling over 11,000 copies in its first few weeks. Swift's argument was constructed with lethal clarity. He argued that Britain, despite having no direct territorial ambitions on the European continent, had been dragged into a continental war as a principal rather than an auxiliary. He asserted that Britain had borne a disproportionate share of the financial burden, spending over £50 million, while her allies consistently failed to meet their treaty obligations. Swift charged that the Dutch Republic had neglected its naval quotas to focus on building a commercial barrier in Flanders, while the Austrian Habsburgs had diverted their forces to Hungary and Italy rather than fighting in Spain. Crucially, Swift attacked the Duke of Marlborough directly, accusing him of prolonging the war for personal gain, military glory, and the vast emoluments of his command. The conduct of the Allies transformed British political discourse. It reframed the war not as a noble crusade against French tyranny, but as a fraudulent enterprise in which British taxpayers were being exploited by greedy foreign allies and corrupt domestic stock jobbers. While Swift was reshaping public opinion, secret diplomatic contacts were already underway between London and Versailles. Neither Harley nor St. John could risk initiating formal public negotiations through standard diplomatic channels, as the Dutch and imperial envoys in London would immediately move to block them. Instead, they utilised an obscure, shadowy intermediary, the Abbé François Gaultier. Gaultier was a French Catholic priest who had lived in London for years, Originally serving as chaplain to the French embassy before the war, he had remained in England under the protection of various aristocratic households, acting as a discreet intelligence agent for the French foreign minister, the Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Torcy. Gaultier possessed connections to both the Jacobite court in exile at Saint-Germain and moderate Tory politicians in London. In July 1710, even before the formal fall of Godolphin's ministry, secret communications were established. In August, Gaultier was dispatched to Paris carrying a verbal message from the new British leadership to Torcy. The message was astonishing in its simplicity and directness. The British ministry asked Torcy a single, decisive question. Did France wish to open private, direct peace negotiations with Britain, completely bypassing the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Emperor? When Torcy received Gaultier at Versailles, he could scarcely believe his fortune. Only a year earlier, France had been subjected to the humiliating preliminary articles at The Hague. Now, the leading maritime power of the Grand Alliance was approaching Versailles in total secrecy, offering to negotiate a separate peace. Torcy responded with immediate enthusiasm, assuring Gaultier that Louis XIV was prepared to offer Britain extraordinary commercial and territorial concessions in exchange for breaking the Allied United Front. Throughout the winter of 1710 and the early spring of 1711, Abbé Gaultier travelled back and forth across the English Channel under false names, carrying folded, ciphered notes between St. John's office in London and Torcy's office at Versailles. The fundamental premise of these secret talks was a radical departure from established Grand Alliance policy. Britain signalled its willingness to accept Philip V as King of Spain if an acceptable settlement could guarantee the permanent separation of the French and Spanish crowns and secure major British commercial and strategic concessions. By negotiating around her allies, Britain was undertaking a deeply controversial separate diplomacy that strained the solidarity of the Grand Alliance. But from the perspective of Harley and St. John, British national interests were paramount. They believed that the Dutch and Austrians had used British wealth and military blood to pursue their own parochial European territorial ambitions while ignoring Britain's maritime and commercial security. Direct bilateral negotiations ensured that Britain could dictate terms that secured her Atlantic empire before her allies could interfere. Then, in April 1711, a sudden dynastic tragedy struck Vienna, shattering the European balance of power and instantly validating the Tory ministry's strategic pivot. On April 17, 1711, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I died unexpectedly in Vienna of smallpox at the age of 32. Joseph died without leaving a surviving son. His younger brother and sole male Habsburg heir was Archduke Charles, the very man whom the Grand Alliance, led by the Whigs, had spent 9 years attempting to place on the throne of Spain. The death of Joseph I fundamentally altered the logic of European geopolitics overnight. If Archduke Charles succeeded his brother as Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI and also acquired the Spanish inheritance, British ministers feared a new and dangerous concentration of Habsburg power. For British statesmen, this realization completely collapsed the moral and strategic argument for continuing the war. The original purpose of the War of the Spanish Succession had been to prevent the concentration of excessive power in the hands of a single dynasty, preserving the balance of power in Europe. To continue pouring British blood and treasure into Spain, simply to replace a potential French hegemony with a massive Austrian Habsburg hegemony was, in Harley and St. John's view, total strategic folly. As Archduke Charles departed Spain for Vienna to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, his departure exposed the total failure of the Allied campaign in the Iberian Peninsula. Philip V retained deep support across important parts of Spain, while the Habsburg position became increasingly concentrated in Catalonia. With the Habsburg strategic argument shattered and secret Anglo-French communications advancing rapidly, Harley, who had survived an assassination attempt in March 1711 by a French refugee, Antoine de Guiscard, and was subsequently created Earl of Oxford and Lord High Treasurer, authorised Henry St. John to accelerate negotiations. In July 1711, the British poet and diplomat Prior was sent to Paris to finalise the preliminary bilateral articles. In October 1711, London and Versailles signed the London Preliminaries, a series of secret agreements that laid the concrete foundation for a general European peace congress. When the terms were leaked to the Dutch and imperial ministers in London, It triggered a storm of outrage and diplomatic protest. The leaked preliminaries generated protests among Britain's allies and intensified fears that a separate peace might upset the political and dynastic guarantees on which the coalition had been built. Undeterred by the fury of her allies or the fierce resistance of the Whig minority in the House of Lords, the Tory ministry pressed forward. In December 1711, Queen Anne took the extraordinary step of creating 12 new Tory peers in a single day, the 12 Apostles, to override the Whig majority in the House of Lords and secure approval for the peace policy. Shortly thereafter, the Duke of Marlborough was formally dismissed from all his military offices, accused of financial irregularities. The political transformation of London was complete. The war triumvirate that had ruled Britain for a decade was dismantled. The stage was now set for formal diplomatic delegations from across Europe to assemble in the Dutch city of Utrecht in early 1712. But the real bargain had already been struck in the secret, whispering rooms of London and Versailles, a bargain that would redefine the map of the world. To understand the political mechanics that made the transition of 1710 possible, one must look past the myth of Queen Anne as a passive monarch swayed entirely by court favourites. Under the Augustan constitution, royal prerogative remained a formidable executive reality. While Anne relied on confidants like Sarah Churchill and later Abigail Masham for emotional support and private counsel, the Queen held firm political principles. She was deeply committed to the Church of England, suspicious of party factionalism, and determined to exercise her personal authority over ministerial appointments. When the relationship between Queen Anne and the Duchess of Marlborough deteriorated over personal and religious disagreements, it created a rift that Robert Harley could exploit. Yet Anne's decision to remove Godolphin and the Whig ministers was not a sudden whim dictated by Abigail Masham. It was a deliberate exercise of royal power by a monarch who viewed the Whig junto as overbearing, feared that the church was under attack from religious dissenters, and felt deeply burdened by the human and financial cost of an endless war. By systematically dismissing Whig leaders one by one, rather than in a single purging, Anne tested the political waters, ensuring that her royal prerogative was backed by growing public sentiment. That public sentiment found its most potent expression in the general election of 1710, an event that demonstrated the unique structure of early 18th-century British parliamentary politics. Before the era of mass democracy, the electorate comprised a tiny fraction of the population, governed by intricate local franchise rules. Members of Parliament were returned from two distinct types of constituencies, county seats and borough seats. The 40-shilling freeholder franchise in the English counties represented a remarkably independent landed electorate. While wealthy landowners and aristocratic patrons could heavily influence small pocket boroughs, the county constituencies were open to broad political mobilization. The trial of Dr. Henry Sacheverell provided the ideal catalyst for Tory mobilization across these county seats. By prosecuting a high church clergyman for asserting doctrines of royal authority and critiquing religious toleration, the Whig administration allowed the Tories to frame the election around a simple, emotionally resonant rally cry: "The Church in danger." Tory election organisers linked the defence of the Anglican Church directly to the economic grievances of the gentry. Pamphleteers argued that the Whigs were sacrificing the traditional, landed, Church of England foundation of the kingdom to benefit a small class of urban moneyed men and foreign allies. When the ballots were cast, Tory candidates swept the county seats and open boroughs, transforming a narrow parliamentary dynamic into an overwhelming Tory majority in the House of Commons. This electoral victory brought to the fore the deep structural conflict within Britain's wartime financial system. To sustain military operations across multiple theatres, the British state had developed a sophisticated system of funded debt. Instead of relying solely on immediate tax receipts, the government borrowed vast sums from chartered corporations, most notably the Bank of England and the New East India Company. In exchange for long-term loans, the state guaranteed these corporations annual interest payments, funded through specific customs duties and excise taxes. This system created a fundamental political divide between what contemporaries termed the landed interest and the moneyed interest. Country gentlemen who paid the 4-shilling land tax saw their real estate burdened to guarantee the returns of London's stock jobbers and war contractors. Furthermore, because the Whigs were closely aligned with the directors of the Bank of England, Tory MPs feared that financial power had concentrated in hands unaccountable to Parliament or the Crown. To counter this influence and establish a rival source of Tory credit, Robert Harley oversaw the chartering of the South Sea Company in 1711. The company assumed £10 million of unfunded government war debt in exchange for a monopoly on British trade with Spanish America, a financial structure designed to tie the landed interest directly to the prospects of a negotiated peace. The debate over that peace was driven by two fundamentally distinct ideological visions of Britain's role in Europe. The fundamental Whig argument for continuing the war was grounded in a coherent strategic logic. Whig statesmen maintained that European stability depended upon stripping the House of Bourbon of its global possessions. They argued that allowing a French prince to remain on the throne of Spain would eventually combine French land power with the vast silver wealth of the Spanish Indies, overwhelming the maritime powers and threatening the Protestant succession in Britain. From the Whig perspective, the heavy sacrifices of the land tax and the national debt were necessary investments to secure a permanent, structural victory over French ambitions. The Tories countered with an equally articulated alternative vision. Led by Harley and St. John, Tory argued that Britain was a maritime and colonial power, not a continental empire. They contended that continental land wars were inherently endless and disproportionately benefited Britain's allies, the Dutch, who sought an expensive military barrier, and the Austrian Habsburgs, who sought Italian and Spanish territories, while Britain paid the bill. Ending the war was not presented by Tories as a retreat, but as a correction, a pivot toward maritime trade, colonial expansion, naval dominance, and domestic fiscal sanity. This debate was fought openly in London's rapidly expanding print culture. The early 18th century saw an explosion of political print, nourished by the expiration of the Licensing Act in 1695. Newspapers, broadsides, published sermons, and political pamphlets were read aloud in the capital's hundreds of coffee houses, where merchants, politicians, and literate citizens gathered daily. Jonathan Swift was the most effective operative in this media environment, but he was a partisan advocate writing to persuade, not a neutral chronicler. In the conduct of the Allies, Swift utilized selective statistics, sharp satire, and legalistic arguments to frame Britain's allies as parasitic predators. Swift deliberately minimized the immense strategic contributions made by Dutch troops and imperial armies in previous campaigns, presenting Allied strategy through a lens of exploitation. The power of Swift's work lay in its ability to take complex treasury figures and diplomatic treaties and translate them into a clear narrative of national betrayal that resonated with a war-weary public. Behind this public print campaign lay the high-stakes reality of secret diplomacy. The channels opened by Abbé Gaultier, Torcy, Harley, and St. John carried immense personal and political risks. Had these bilateral contacts been fully exposed in late 1710 or early 1711, Harley and St. John could have faced parliamentary impeachment for high treason for negotiating separate terms with an enemy state while bound by Grand Alliance treaties. For France, the Channel was a lifeline. Torcy recognized that by offering major commercial concessions to Britain, including territorial outposts and Atlantic trade privileges, France could break the Grand Alliance at its strongest link. If Britain withdrew her navy and her subsidies, the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire would be unable to sustain large-scale offensive operations inside France. For Britain, the secret channel offered a way to secure maximum commercial advantage before her allies could claim a seat at the bargaining table. The sudden death of Emperor Joseph I in April 1711 dramatically shifted these strategic calculations, though the reality was more nuanced than Tory pamphleteers suggested. When Archduke Charles became Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, Tory politicians immediately argued that continuing the war to place Charles on the Spanish throne would reconstitute the 16th-century empire of Charles V, creating a dangerous Habsburg hegemony. In reality, the Austrian Habsburgs lacked the naval power and financial infrastructure to fully integrate Spain and the Americas in the manner of the 16th century. Allied diplomats argued that guarantees could be established to keep the crown separate, just as guarantees were being demanded of France. But as a piece of political persuasion in London, the Tory argument was devastatingly effective. It provided a clean, easily understood strategic rationale for abandoning the No Peace Without Spain pledge, allowing the ministry to frame peace not as a compromise, but as a defense of the European balance of power. The political shift in London became even more striking because it unfolded while Marlborough was still demonstrating that he had not lost his military skill. During the campaign of 1711, the Duke faced a French defensive system intended to block another Allied advance into northern France. Rather than throw his army directly against prepared positions, Marlborough used deception and rapid movement to turn the French lines and open the way toward Bouchain. The fortress was isolated and, after a difficult siege, surrendered in September. Bouchain gave the Whigs an obvious argument. Their commander was still winning. French defences could still be penetrated. Another campaign, they insisted, might force Louis XIV to concede more than the Tories were prepared to accept at the negotiating table. Military success therefore did not simplify the political debate, it sharpened it. To supporters of the existing strategy, Bouchain proved that perseverance was working. To the ministry, it demonstrated precisely why a decision had to be made about the purpose of the war. A capable army could continue taking fortresses for years if the government never defined the point at which enough had been gained. The disagreement was really about the relationship between battlefield victory and political settlement. Marlborough's critics did not need to prove that he was a poor general. They needed to argue that no sequence of victories could justify an unlimited commitment to the original war aims. His supporters, in turn, feared that negotiating while the Allied armies remained strong would surrender advantages purchased at enormous cost. This is one reason the fall of Marlborough cannot be understood simply as a story of personal rivalry at court. Sarah Churchill's broken relationship with Queen Anne mattered. Charges about money and patronage mattered. Party hatred mattered. But beneath all of it stood a strategic question that governments repeatedly face in long wars: whether military success should be used to continue the war or to end it. By the winter of 1711, the Queen and her Tory ministers had chosen the second answer. Queen Anne's role in this transformation is important because the political system still gave the monarch meaningful choices. Ministers needed parliamentary support, but they also needed access to the crown. Anne could dismiss office holders, create peers, choose whom to consult, and decide which faction would be entrusted with government. Her preference for peace did not by itself determine the final settlement, but it made the Tory strategy possible. That also meant the peace policy carried personal political risk for the Queen. A failed negotiation could expose Britain to accusations of betraying allies without securing adequate concessions. A collapse of public credit could discredit the ministry she had chosen. Anne's support therefore tied the prestige of the crown to the success of the negotiations. By late 1711, peace was no longer merely a Tory proposal, it had become royal policy. The political struggle reached its climax in the winter of 1711 as the ministry prepared to bring the preliminary peace terms before Parliament. The Whig opposition in the House of Lords, reinforced by dissatisfied Tory peers like the Earl of Nottingham, formed an alliance to defeat the government's peace policy. Passing a resolution stating that no peace could be safe if Spain and the West Indies were left to the House of Bourbon, the Lords posed a direct challenge to the ministry's executive authority. The ministry's response was swift and unprecedented. On December 31st, 1711, Queen Anne exercised her royal prerogative to create 12 new Tory peers in a single batch, packing the House of Lords and securing a working ministerial majority. This constitutional manoeuvre was accompanied by the dramatic dismissal of the Duke of Marlborough from all public employment. Marlborough was stripped of his military command and his position as Master General of the Ordnance, following allegations of financial irregularities regarding troop subsidies and army bread contracts. The creation of the 12 peers and the downfall of Marlborough demonstrated the absolute determination of the Crown and the Tory administration to enforce their peace policy. The domestic opposition was broken, the military leadership was transformed, and Britain entered the upcoming Congress at Utrecht, committed to securing a negotiated end to the conflict. On January 29, 1712, in the ancient Dutch city of Utrecht, formal diplomatic delegations gathered to open what was announced as a General European Peace Congress. The choice of Utrecht was a calculated compromise. Situated in the province of Utrecht, within the United Provinces, the city offered a neutral, accessible, and quiet setting away from the intense domestic politics of London, Paris, or The Hague. Yet behind the formal pageantry of assembled plenipotentiaries representing dozens of sovereign entities, the fundamental architecture of the peace had already been drawn in secret bilateral negotiations between the crowns of Great Britain and France. To understand how early 18th century diplomacy operated at Utrecht, one must examine the complex protocols, legalities, and social hierarchies that governed European interstate relations. Congress diplomacy in this era was not a modern parliamentary assembly operating under majority vote. It was an intricate, highly ritualized network of bilateral and multilateral negotiations where matters of rank, precedence, and diplomatic etiquette were inextricably linked to sovereign power. Delegations arrived in Utrecht representing a vast spectrum of European belligerents. The British embassy was led by John Robinson, Bishop of Bristol and Lord Privy Seal, alongside Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. The French crown sent Nicolas Chalon-Doublé, Marquis d'Uxelles, a Marshal of France, Abbé Melchior de Polignac, and Nicolas Mesnager, a skilled commercial negotiator from Rouen. The Dutch Republic was represented by a committee of delegates from the States General, including Willem Buys and Bruno van der Dussen. The Holy Roman Empire dispatched Count Johann Wenzel Wratislaw and later Count Peter Karl von Zinzendorf to represent the interests of Emperor Charles VI. Dozens of minor German principalities, Italian duchies, Savoy, Portugal, and Prussia sent envoys to protect their specific territorial and dynastic claims. The mechanics of the Congress reflected the deeply fragmented nature of European political authority. French was increasingly becoming the lingua franca of European diplomacy, gradually replacing Latin in formal negotiations and correspondence, though official credentials and treaty instruments maintained traditional Latin formulas. Sessions took place at the Stadhuis, the city hall of Utrecht. To avoid insoluble disputes over seating precedence among sovereign representatives, negotiators took precautions, entering rooms through separate doors, sitting at circular tables, or meeting in informal committees without explicit ranking. These formal public sessions at the Stadhuis supplied the legal and multilateral framework of the Congress. At the same time, much of the detailed bargaining occurred through private correspondence, discreet visits, and parallel channels linking London, Versailles, and The Hague. Plenipotentiaries spent hours daily writing detailed, ciphered dispatches to their respective state secretaries and monarchs. Diplomatic couriers rode continuously between Utrecht, Paris, and London, carrying instructions that often rendered the public debate at the Congress obsolete before it even began. Beneath the multilateral facade of the Congress lay the core British-French understanding established during the secret contacts of 1711. The British ministry, headed by Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, and Henry St. John, Secretary of State, had defined clear national priorities. Britain sought absolute commercial and maritime supremacy. This meant acquiring strategic Mediterranean naval posts, securing exclusive trade privileges in Spanish America, gaining territorial concessions in North America, and obtaining formal French recognition of the Protestant succession and the expulsion of the Jacobite pretender, James Francis Edward Stuart, from French territory. For Louis XIV, exhausted by years of famine, fiscal collapse, and military attrition, the primary objective was the survival of his dynasty and the preservation of his grandson, Philip V, on the throne of Spain. If France could retain Spain and the Spanish Indies within the Bourbon dynastic sphere, Louis was prepared to make sweeping territorial and commercial concessions to Great Britain. As the weeks turned into months in early 1712, Dutch, imperial, and minor allied envoys grew increasingly suspicious. They observed that the British plenipotentiaries, Bishop Robinson and Lord Strafford, frequently acted not as leaders of the anti-Bourbon coalition, but as intermediaries working to protect French proposals. When the Grand Alliance partners presented their formal demands to the French delegation in February 1712, the imperial and Dutch envoys demanded the complete restitution of the entire Spanish monarchy to Charles VI. The French delegation flatly rejected these demands, knowing that London had already agreed in principle to the partition of the Spanish Empire and the retention of Madrid by Philip V. While diplomatic debates dragged on at Utrecht, the military situation on the Western Front reached a critical and controversial crisis in the spring and summer of 1712. Following the dismissal of the Duke of Marlborough in December 1711, Queen Anne appointed James Butler, 2nd Duke of Ormond, to command the British forces and the mercenary troops in British pay in Flanders. Ormond took the field alongside the imperial commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy, who commanded a powerful Allied army superior in numbers to the French forces led by Marshal Claude Louis Hector de Villars. Prince Eugene planned a vigorous offensive campaign, intending to besiege the remaining French border fortresses of Quesnoy and Landrecies, break through the last defensive barrier guarding Paris, and force Louis XIV to accept severe peace terms. However, secret orders were already being drafted in London. On May 21, 1712, Henry St. John dispatched a confidential letter to the Duke of Ormond containing what became known as the restraining orders. St. John informed Ormond that secret negotiations between London and Versailles had advanced so far that a general suspension of arms was imminent. St. John explicitly ordered Ormond to avoid engaging in any siege or battle against the French army under Marshal Villars. St. John wrote that Ormond must disguise these instructions from Prince Eugene and the Dutch field deputies, maintaining the appearance of military cooperation while privately ensuring that no British soldiers were put at risk. The restraining orders placed Ormond in an extraordinarily difficult operational and moral position. When Prince Eugene proposed attacking Villars' army or supporting the siege of Quesnoy, Ormond was forced to make bureaucratic excuses, refusing to march or commit his artillery. Prince Eugene and the Dutch deputies soon deduced that Britain had entered into a private agreement with the enemy. In June 1712, Ormond formally declared an armistice between British and French forces. When Ormond ordered the British troops and the foreign auxiliary regiments under British pay to march away from Prince Eugene's camp toward Dunkirk, he encountered widespread resistance. Most of the German auxiliary officers, whose troops were paid by British subsidies but owed allegiance to Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, and other German states, refused to follow Ormond's orders, choosing instead to remain under the operational command of Prince Eugene. Only the native British units withdrew. The effective military withdrawal of Great Britain shattered the operational cohesion of the Grand Alliance. Prince Eugene was left with a diminished, heterogeneous army. Despite the loss of the British forces, Eugene pressed forward with the siege of Landrecies, extending his supply lines back toward the main Allied depots at Marchiennes. This overextension presented Marshal Villars with a vital opportunity. Armed with secret intelligence and aware that he no longer had to fear an attack from Ormond's flank, Villars executed a fast, decisive maneuver in July 1712. Masking his true intentions by feigning a movement toward Landrecies, Villars rapidly swung his forces toward the small town of Denain on the Scheldt River. On July 24, 1712, Villars struck the Allied detachment entrenched at Denain, commanded by the Earl of Albemarle. Prince Eugene rushed to reinforce the position, but a collapsed pontoon bridge delayed his troops, preventing them from crossing the Scheldt in time. The French army overwhelmed Albemarle's fortifications, killing or capturing thousands of Allied soldiers and securing a complete tactical victory. The Battle of Denain was a decisive turning point in the War of the Spanish Succession. In the weeks following the battle, Villars exploited his success with relentless speed. He captured the vital Allied supply depot at Marchiennes, cutting off Prince Eugene's ammunition and provisions and forcing the imperial commander to abandon the siege of Landrecies. Villars then systematically recaptured the key border fortresses of Douai, Le Quesnoy, and Bouchain, territory that Marlborough and Eugene had spent years of heavy bloodshed to acquire. The strategic impact of Denain on the negotiations at Utrecht was immediate and profound. Prior to Denain, the French crown had been negotiating from a position of near total exhaustion and military vulnerability. Denain demonstrated that the French army remained a formidable fighting force, capable of defending its national territory. It broke the myth of Allied invincibility on the Western Front, restored domestic morale in France, and significantly strengthened Louis XIV's diplomatic leverage. For the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire, Denain was a severe setback. It proved that without British military participation and naval backing, the remaining allies could not force Louis XIV to concede better terms than those already agreed upon in the secret Anglo-French preliminaries. The victory at Denain effectively sealed the fate of the multilateral negotiations at Utrecht, ensuring that the peace would be dictated on the terms negotiated between London and Versailles. The heart of the diplomatic enterprise at Utrecht lay in resolving the dynastic crisis that had triggered 12 years of continental war, the dual inheritance of the Spanish monarchy. From the opening of negotiations, European statesmen recognized that no peace could endure without a legally binding mechanism to prevent the crowns of France and Spain from ever uniting on the head of a single sovereign. The core compromise was established around Philip V, who retained the throne of Spain and the Spanish East and West Indies. In exchange for maintaining his crown in Madrid, Philip executed a formal, solemn renunciation of all personal and dynastic rights to the French throne for himself and his descendants. Reciprocally, the remaining French royal princes, including Philip's brother, the Duke of Berry, and his nephew, the Duke of Orléans, executed corresponding renunciations, surrendering all future claims to the Spanish monarchy. These renunciations were incorporated into public treaties, ratified by the Parlement of Paris, and solemnly sworn before religious and state assemblies. Yet contemporary jurists and statesmen harbored intense skepticism regarding their legal durability. Under the fundamental laws of the French kingdom, Loi fondamentale du royaume, royal succession was considered an inviolable divine right that no king or prince could voluntarily alienate or surrender by treaty. Whig pamphleteers in London and imperial diplomats in Vienna argued that if the young Louis XV were to die without heirs, no piece of paper signed at Utrecht would prevent Philip V from claiming his ancestral crown in Paris, instantly uniting the two empires. Despite these legal ambiguities, the settlement represented a pragmatic, middle-tier compromise. It failed to achieve the total expulsion of the Bourbons demanded by the Whigs and Austrians, but it successfully prevented Louis XIV from directly integrating the resources of Spain into the French state, establishing a fragile balance of power. This dynastic compromise was reflected in the territorial restructuring of the European continent. What contemporary history terms the Peace of Utrecht was not a single comprehensive treaty signed on a single day by all belligerents. It was an intricate web of separate bilateral treaties signed between various sovereign powers, principally throughout 1713, supplemented by subsequent treaties signed in 1714. Great Britain secured major naval and strategic outposts in southern Europe. By the terms of the Anglo-Spanish Treaty signed in July 1713, Spain formally ceded to Great Britain full ownership of the fortress and Rock of Gibraltar, along with the Mediterranean island of Minorca and its deep-water harbour at Port Mahon. These acquisitions provided the Royal Navy with permanent operational bases inside the Mediterranean, fundamentally transforming British naval projection in southern Europe. Gibraltar and Minorca illustrate the difference between possessing territory and possessing strategic position. Neither acquisition was valuable simply because of acreage. Their importance came from harbours, fortifications, and location. Gibraltar sat beside the narrow entrance to the Mediterranean. Port Mahon on Minorca offered a deep anchorage from which warships could operate far from British home ports. In an age when sailing fleets depended on secure places to repair, resupply, shelter, and gather intelligence, a harbour could influence an entire maritime theatre. The value of such bases also depended on continued expenditure. Walls had to be repaired, guns had to be mounted and supplied, garrisons had to be fed and paid, naval stores had to be accumulated. A treaty could transfer a fortress in a sentence. Converting that fortress into lasting strategic power required years of administration and money. Britain's gains at Utrecht therefore reinforced the same lesson already visible in the war itself. Geography mattered most when a state possessed the financial and institutional capacity to use it. The renunciations worked in a similar way. Their purpose was legal rather than geographic, but they too depended on continuing political acceptance. No treaty could physically prevent a future claimant from asserting a dynastic right. What the documents did was raise the diplomatic and legal cost of such a claim by creating a public record of obligations accepted by the principal powers. The balance rested partly on fortresses and fleets, and partly on the expectation that governments would treat those promises as binding. The European territories of the Spanish monarchy outside the Iberian Peninsula were disassembled to satisfy Allied security demands and compensate the Austrian Habsburgs. The Spanish Netherlands, a long-standing region of conflict bordering the United Provinces and France, was transferred to Austrian control, becoming the Austrian Netherlands. In Italy, the Spanish possessions were partitioned. The Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, and the island of Sardinia were transferred to Austrian Habsburg rule, expanding Austria's territorial footprint in Italy. The Duchy of Savoy was substantially elevated in rank and territory. Victor Amadeus II of Savoy received the Kingdom of Sicily along with valuable Alpine border territories, granting him royal status and creating a buffer state between France and Austrian-controlled Lombardy. Duke Frederick I of Prussia achieved formal international recognition of his royal title as King in Prussia, alongside territorial acquisitions in Upper Guelders and Neuchâtel. Portugal received minor boundary adjustments along its South American frontier with Spanish possessions. For Great Britain, the diplomatic negotiations at Utrecht were inextricably linked to domestic political stability and the security of the Protestant succession. Since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the exiled Catholic Stuart line had lived under French protection at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Queen Anne's government insisted that Louis XIV withdraw all diplomatic recognition from James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of King James II, known to his supporters as the King over the Water, and to his opponents as the Old Pretender. Under the Anglo-French Treaty of April 1713, Louis XIV recognized Queen Anne as the lawful sovereign of Great Britain and formally acknowledged the Protestant line established by the Act of Settlement of 1701, which designated the Electress Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant heirs as successors to the British crown. Louis XIV pledged never to assist or harbour the Jacobite claimant or his descendants within French territory. James Francis Edward Stuart was obliged to leave France, relocating to the territory of the Duke of Lorraine. Furthermore, Louis XIV agreed to demolish the fortifications and fill in the harbour of Dunkirk, a primary base for French privateers that directly threatened English Channel shipping. In North America and the Atlantic Basin, the Treaty of Utrecht produced a major reordering of imperial claims, transferring vast territories from France to Great Britain. France ceded to the British Crown its claims to Hudson Bay and the territories situated around it, strengthening the Hudson's Bay Company's position within a vast fur trading network. France also relinquished its claims to the island of Newfoundland, recognizing full British sovereignty while retaining specific, limited seasonal privileges for French fishermen along the northern and western shores, an area that became known as the French Shore. In Acadia, France ceded control of the mainland territory, which Britain renamed Nova Scotia. In the West Indies, France surrendered its half of the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, granting Britain complete control of the sugar-producing island. These Atlantic transfers represented a major expansion of British imperial claims, but the language of the treaties contained profound geographic ambiguities. The treaty described the cession of Acadia as encompassing the territory with its ancient boundaries, without defining where those boundaries lay on the ground. France maintained that Acadia referred only to the southern peninsula of Nova Scotia, while Britain claimed that it encompassed modern New Brunswick and eastern Maine. Furthermore, these European treaty instruments entirely ignored the sovereignty of the indigenous populations, such as the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Haudenosaunee, who lived on and controlled these lands. Neither Britain nor France possessed comprehensive territorial control on the ground, and the unresolved boundary clauses drafted at Utrecht laid the direct territorial groundwork for future imperial conflicts in North America decades later. Parallel to these territorial adjustments was the acquisition of the Asiento de Negros, a commercial agreement that converted human captivity into an instrument of European state finance and imperial diplomacy. The Asiento was an exclusive monopoly contract issued by the Spanish crown that granted a foreign commercial enterprise the sole legal privilege of supplying enslaved African laborers to Spanish-American ports. For over 2 centuries, Spain's mercantilist system had strictly restricted foreign trade in its American colonies. Because the Spanish Empire lacked direct access to slave trading outposts on the West African coast, Madrid relied on foreign contractors, first Portuguese, then Dutch, and most recently the French Compagnie de Guinée, to import enslaved labor into its mining and agricultural centers. At Utrecht, British negotiators demanded and secured the transfer of the Asiento contract from France to Great Britain. By the terms of the Anglo-Spanish Asiento Treaty signed in May 1713, the British Crown was granted a 30-year exclusive monopoly. The contract authorized the importation of 4,800 enslaved African human beings per year into Spanish America, a total contractual target of 144,000 people over 30 years. The British government assigned the contract to the South Sea Company, whose directors and investors included prominent political and financial figures. To facilitate this trade, the contract allowed the South Sea Company to establish permanent factories and warehouses at key Spanish-American ports, including Cartagena, Portobello, Veracruz, Havana, and Buenos Aires. Accompanying the asiento was an unprecedented commercial concession known as the Navío de Permiso, the right of the South Sea Company to send one 500-ton British merchant ship annually filled with British-manufactured goods directly to the trade fairs of Spanish America. British merchants and politicians prized the asiento and the Navío de Permiso not merely for the direct profits of the slave trade, but because the contract provided a legal foothold inside the closed, wealth-generating markets of Spanish America. The annual ship and the factory outposts served as covers for widespread contraband trade, allowing British manufactured goods and textiles to be smuggled past Spanish customs officials in exchange for silver bullion. Yet beneath the corporate structures, stock prices, and diplomatic triumphs lay a brutal reality. The Treaty of Utrecht institutionalized and expanded Britain's official role in the transatlantic slave trade. Tens of thousands of African men, women, and children were forcibly seized, shackled, transported across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, and auctioned off in Spanish-American ports to labor in silver mines, sugar plantations, and urban estates. In the boardrooms of London and the negotiating chambers of Utrecht, European statesmen viewed this human suffering through the lens of balance of power diplomacy, transforming human lives into negotiated commercial assets. While Britain secured these commercial and imperial advantages, the United Provinces emerged from the Peace Congress with its long-term strategic position deeply altered. The primary objective of the Dutch Republic throughout the war had been security, the establishment of a formidable military barrier in the Spanish Netherlands to protect the Republic from future French invasions. Under the terms of the Second Barrier Treaty signed in January 1713 and refined in subsequent agreements, the Dutch achieved their core military objective. Dutch garrisons were authorized to occupy a chain of key fortresses in the Austrian Netherlands, including Namur, Tournai, Menin, Furnes, Ypres, and Warneton. The cost of maintaining these garrisons was to be funded from the revenues of the Austrian Netherlands. Yet this security came at a crushing financial and political cost. 12 years of continuous warfare had exhausted the public finances of the Dutch Republic, leaving the state burdened with immense public debt. Furthermore, the Dutch felt profoundly betrayed by Britain's secret bilateral diplomacy with France. While the Dutch secured their immediate land barrier, Britain's acquisition of strategic naval outposts and the asiento contract signaled a permanent shift in maritime and commercial dominance. Utrecht marked an important shift in relative power. The Dutch Republic remained wealthy and influential, but heavy debt and continental defense costs increasingly constrained its foreign policy as Britain expanded its maritime and financial reach. When the principal treaties of Utrecht were signed in April 1713, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI stood conspicuously absent from the peace. From the perspective of the imperial court in Vienna, the bilateral agreement struck between London and Versailles was not a compromise, but a fundamental breach of faith. For Charles VI, the Spanish succession was not merely an abstract geopolitical balance of power calculation. It was a legitimate dynastic inheritance guaranteed to the House of Habsburg by international treaties dating back to the Grand Alliance of 1701. To accept Philip V on the throne in Madrid meant surrendering Spain and the vast wealth of the Spanish Americas to a French Bourbon prince. Furthermore, the imperial leadership believed that Austrian armies, having secured Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, still possessed the military leverage to extract superior terms directly from a weakened France. Consequently, while Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Savoy, Portugal, and Prussia laid down their arms, the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France remained actively at war throughout 1713. Imperial forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy faced French forces commanded by Marshal Villars along the Rhine frontier. Without British financial subsidies and Dutch troop contributions, however, the Imperial Field Army was severely outmatched. Marshal Villars launched a highly effective offensive along the Rhine, besieging and capturing the vital imperial fortresses of Landau and Freiburg in the autumn of 1713. These military reverses demonstrated to Charles VI that the empire could not sustain an isolated war against France without European allies. Financial exhaustion in Vienna and strategic necessity in Paris drove both sovereigns toward direct bilateral negotiations. In November 1713, Prince Eugene and Marshal Villars met face-to-face at the castle of Rastatt in Baden. The two opposing generals, who had spent years facing each other on European battlefields, served as the primary plenipotentiaries for their respective monarchs. Their negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Rastatt, signed in March 1714. Because Eugene negotiated as the representative of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy rather than the Holy Roman Empire as a collective body, a second, formal diplomatic congress was required to bind the German estates. This led to the Treaty of Baden, signed in September 1714 by representatives of the Holy Roman Empire. Together, the treaties of Rastatt and Baden formally ended the conflict between France and the Holy Roman Empire, confirming the territorial realities established at Utrecht while making crucial adjustments. Austria formally accepted the loss of the Spanish throne to Philip V. In return, France recognized Austrian possession of former Spanish territories in Europe, the Spanish Netherlands, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, and the island of Sardinia. France also evacuated its remaining military outposts east of the Rhine, returning Kehl and Freiburg to the empire, while retaining Strasbourg and Alsace. The sequential progression from Utrecht in April 1713 to Rastatt in March 1714 and Baden in September 1714 illustrates that the War of the Spanish Succession did not end in a single ceremonial moment. The peace was constructed through a staggered, piecemeal series of bilateral compromises, forced by a combination of secret diplomacy, military attrition, and financial necessity. The treaties also had to move from diplomatic language into administrative reality. A peace agreement did not become effective everywhere at the instant a plenipotentiary placed his seal on parchment. Ratifications had to be exchanged. Orders had to be carried to commanders who might be weeks away by road or sea. Garrisons had to evacuate fortresses. New authorities had to take possession of ports, islands, and customs houses. Prisoners had to be released or exchanged. Merchants needed to know whether a ship that had been an enemy prize 1 month earlier could now enter a harbour legally the next. That process could be slow, uneven, and contested. A clause that appeared precise in a European chancery might become ambiguous when officials tried to apply it to a river valley, a fishing coast, or a frontier where maps were incomplete and sovereignty was shared, disputed, or simply ignored by the people who lived there. Utrecht therefore created not only settlements, but also new arguments about what those settlements actually meant. This was particularly clear in the Atlantic world. European diplomats could transfer claims to Acadia or Hudson Bay in a few lines of treaty language, but imperial possession depended on much more than words. Forts had to be occupied, traders had to redirect networks, colonial officials had to interpret boundaries that had never been surveyed in the modern sense. Indigenous nations continued to pursue their own diplomacy, warfare, trade, and territorial claims, regardless of what distant monarchs had agreed to in the Netherlands. The map of empire was cleaner on paper than it was on the ground. The same problem appeared in commerce. The asiento and the annual licensed ship promised access to Spanish-American markets, but access was not the same thing as unrestricted trade. Spanish officials remained determined to protect the legal monopoly of their imperial system. British merchants were equally determined to stretch every commercial opening as far as possible. Inspectors, customs officers, company agents, captains, and local merchants therefore became the people who translated high diplomacy into daily practice. Their disputes over cargoes, duties, inspections, and contraband would outlive many of the diplomats who had drafted the original clauses. Even within Europe, the territorial settlement required constant management. Austria acquired lands that had previously belonged to the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, but acquisition brought obligations, administration, military defense, local privileges, and the cost of maintaining garrisons. The Dutch barrier promised security, but someone had to pay for the troops and fortifications. Savoy's new royal dignity increased its standing, yet also placed the dynasty inside a more complicated Italian balance. A treaty could redistribute strategic assets. It could not eliminate the expense of holding them. This helps explain why the phrase balance of power should not be imagined as a perfectly measured set of scales. The balance created after Utrecht was dynamic. It depended on governments watching one another, forming alliances, financing armies, negotiating marriages, protecting trade routes, and responding when one state appeared to gain too much. The settlement reduced the immediate danger that had produced the war, but it did not remove rivalry from Europe. It created a framework within which rivalry would continue. This complexity is equally apparent in the defensive arrangements designed to protect the Dutch Republic. While earlier accounts often reduced the Dutch barrier to a simple territorial concession, the barrier system was an intricate geopolitical and financial framework designed to solve a specific strategic problem: the geographic vulnerability of the United Provinces to French invasion across the flat terrain of the Low Countries. Under the refined barrier arrangements finalized in the Third Barrier Treaty of 1715, the Dutch Republic secured the legal right to garrison a line of strategic fortresses in the newly designated Austrian Netherlands. These fortresses, including Namur, Tournai, Menin, Ypres, Furnez, and Warneton, were located within territory sovereign to the Austrian Habsburgs, creating a unique legal and military structure where Dutch Protestant troops were permanently stationed inside Catholic Austrian lands. In practice, the barrier system was fraught with institutional tension. The financial burden of maintaining, repairing, and provisioning these border fortresses was supposed to be met from local tax revenues collected within the Austrian Netherlands. However, Austrian authorities consistently resented paying for a foreign Dutch military presence inside their own borders, leading to endless administrative friction and chronic underfunding of the garrisons. Furthermore, while the barrier provided physical defense against a potential French ground assault, the financial cost of sustaining more than a decade of total war had damaged the Dutch state. To finance its massive army and navy, the Republic had accumulated a staggering public debt, requiring a huge portion of annual tax revenues simply to service interest payments to bondholders. Yet historians caution against viewing 1713 as the precise moment the Dutch Republic suddenly ceased to be a great power. The United Provinces remained one of the wealthiest commercial nations in Europe, possessing immense capital markets, an influential merchant fleet, and extensive colonial holdings in Asia and the Caribbean. What changed at Utrecht was not an instant collapse of Dutch capability, but a shift in relative power. Great Britain had expanded its naval capacity, transatlantic territory, and state financial systems at an unprecedented rate, while the Dutch Republic, constrained by high debt and heavy continental defense costs, was forced to adopt a more conservative, defensive foreign policy. A similar pattern of unresolved compromise characterized the Atlantic territorial settlement. The Treaty of Utrecht transferred vast regions in North America on paper, but the treaty text contained provisions that reflected the limits of European authority on the ground. In Newfoundland, while France recognized full British sovereignty over the island, the treaty explicitly preserved the right of French fishermen to catch and dry fish along a specified stretch of the northern and western coast. This arrangement protected France's valuable cod fishing industry and trained thousands of French merchant sailors, preserving a crucial maritime reserve for the French Navy. In Acadia, the treaty transferred the mainland territory to Great Britain under the phrase Acadia with its ancient boundaries. Because these boundaries were never defined in geographic detail, the treaty created an immediate territorial dispute. To offset the loss of Acadian territory, France retained possession of Île Royale, modern Cape Breton Island, where the French crown immediately began constructing the massive naval fortress of Louisbourg to guard the entrance to the St. Lawrence River and protect the approaches to New France. Crucially, the European diplomats at Utrecht negotiated these territorial transfers as though North America were an unpopulated expanse subject entirely to European legal instruments. In reality, the vast majority of these lands were inhabited and controlled by powerful indigenous nations. Nations such as the Wabanaki Confederacy in the northeast and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the west operated as autonomous political and military powers. they did not recognize the right of European monarchs in Utrecht to transfer their ancestral homelands by treaty. The ambiguous language drafted in European negotiating rooms created a fragile, contested frontier that led directly to decades of military conflict along the North American borderlands. The commercial concessions negotiated at Utrecht produced equally complex long-term consequences, particularly regarding the Asiento de Negros. The acquisition of this contract was not merely a trade concession, it was deeply interwoven with the financial strategy of the British state. The South Sea Company, which managed the Asiento, was founded as an engine of state credit. By absorbing over £9 million of unfunded government war debt in exchange for a guaranteed annual interest payment and the exclusive monopoly on trade with Spanish America, the company bound the fortunes of British investors directly to the success of the slave trade and Spanish-American commerce. British public opinion, fueled by speculative promotional pamphlets, anticipated vast profits from access to the silver mines and markets of Mexico and Peru. The reality of the Asiento trade, however, differed sharply from these financial expectations. The contract was subject to strict Spanish bureaucratic regulation. Spanish authorities in ports like Cartagena, Havana, and Veracruz monitored British ships closely, imposing taxes, inspecting cargoes, and frequently delaying operations through legal disputes. Furthermore, British merchants utilized the legal presence of South Sea Company factories and the annual Navio de Permiso ship as covers for extensive contraband trade. Smuggling networks operated continuously out of Jamaica and Barbados, funneling unauthorized textiles and manufactured goods into Spanish-American markets in exchange for untaxed silver bullion. This dynamic generated friction between London and Madrid. Spanish Coast Guard vessels, guardacostas, routinely intercepted, searched, and seized British merchant ships suspected of smuggling, leading to allegations of piracy and brutal treatment on both sides. Rather than establishing a harmonious commercial alliance, the Asiento and its accompanying trade rights created a persistent source of diplomatic conflict, laying the direct groundwork for future naval confrontations, including the War of Jenkins's Ear, 26 years later. Throughout these commercial calculations, legal disputes, and financial projections, the human reality of the trade remains stark. The Asiento Agreement treated human beings as contractual trade units, subject to quotas, taxes, and shipping manifests. Behind every financial balance sheet of the South Sea Company were thousands of African men, women, and children subjected to forced march, factory confinement, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and lifelong forced labor. The diplomatic system at Utrecht embedded this system of commercialized human bondage into the formal structure of international law. While the diplomats at Utrecht, Rastatt, and Baden signed treaties rebalancing the European state system, the immediate human and political price of that peace was felt most acutely in Catalonia. Throughout the War of the Spanish Succession, the Principality of Catalonia had served as the primary Iberian stronghold for the Allied cause and Archduke Charles. Encouraged in part by British commitments made in the 1705 Pact of Genoa to support Catalan liberties, the Catalans had remained aligned with the Habsburg claimant. However, when the British ministry executed its strategic pivot and withdrew its forces under the restraining orders in 1712, followed by the evacuation of imperial troops in 1713, Catalonia was abandoned to the army of Philip V. Feeling betrayed by their former allies, the Catalan authorities in Barcelona refused to submit to the Bourbon monarch, resolving to continue the struggle alone in defense of their civic rights. The resulting siege of Barcelona became one of the most stubborn and brutal military engagements of the entire war. For over 14 months, the city was completely encircled by French and Spanish armies under the command of James Fitzjames, Duke of Berwick. Heavy artillery bombardment reduced vast sections of Barcelona to rubble. Despite severe food shortages and overwhelming numbers, Barcelona's defenders continued their resistance while the city's municipal government, the Consell de Cent, operated alongside other Catalan institutions. On September 11, 1714, Bourbon forces launched a massive final assault, breaching the city's battered walls. Hand-to-hand fighting raged through the streets before the defenders were forced to capitulate. The occupation of Barcelona was followed by the dismantling of Catalan autonomy, culminating in the Nueva Planta decree for Catalonia in 1716, which abolished traditional governing institutions and imposed a more centralised administrative structure. In London, Britain's abandonment of the Catalans became a subject of intense parliamentary debate and moral outrage. Whig politicians condemned the Tory ministry for sacrificing a loyal ally, coining the phrase, "the case of the Catalans," as a symbol of dishonourable diplomacy. For the Dutch Republic, the brutal subjugation of Catalonia reinforced deep, lingering anxieties about the long-term security of smaller states within a European balance of power dictated by the great maritime and territorial empires. The death of Queen Anne in August 1714 added another layer of uncertainty to this already unsettled European landscape. For years, French support for the Stuart claimants had been one of the issues binding British domestic politics to continental diplomacy. The accession of George I under the Protestant succession therefore mattered beyond Britain itself. It demonstrated that the dynastic arrangements defended by the wartime coalition and recognised in the peace could survive the death of the monarch around whom so much of British policy had revolved. The political consequences in London were swift. The Tory ministry that had negotiated the peace lost its position, and the Whigs returned to power under a king who had distrusted the separate diplomacy with France. The treaties, however, were not simply discarded. Britain might condemn the men who had made the settlement while continuing to benefit from Gibraltar, Mediterranean access, Atlantic claims, and the commercial concessions obtained at Utrecht. That separation between partisan judgment and state interest helped give the peace durability. France watched the Hanoverian succession carefully. Louis XIV had recognized the Protestant succession in the treaty settlement, but Jacobite politics did not disappear. James Francis Edward Stuart still had supporters in Britain and abroad, and the possibility of a disputed succession remained part of European calculations. Yet in 1714, the transfer of the British crown occurred without a French attempt to overturn it by force. For a continent only recently at war, that restraint mattered. The first months of the French Regency likewise showed that the end of Louis XIV's personal rule did not mean the end of the state he had built. Orléans inherited ministries, councils, tax systems, diplomatic networks, and a professional army. His problem was not to create a government from nothing, but to govern institutions burdened by debt and shaped by decades of royal centralization. The Polysynodie was one attempt to change the way those institutions worked. Instead of relying so heavily on the secretaries of state associated with the previous reign, the Regency created councils in which high nobles participated in the administration of war, foreign affairs, finance, the navy, and internal government. The experiment was partly political. It offered members of the high aristocracy a more visible role after decades in which Louis XIV had kept them close to court while limiting their independent power. In practice, councils could be slower than concentrated ministerial offices, and the system did not last. But its creation tells us something about the mood after 1715. The new regime wanted continuity without simply imitating the old king. France still needed revenue, diplomacy, and military readiness, yet there was also a desire to reconsider how power had been organized during the final decades of the Sun King's reign. That tension between continuity and reaction was one of Louis XIV's most important legacies. His successors inherited a stronger administrative monarchy, but they also inherited the debts, expectations, and political resentments produced by the same system. The magnificent machinery of the state survived the man who had dominated it. So did the unresolved question of how long that machinery could be financed. The restored right of remonstrance was another sign that the Regency would not reproduce the last years of Louis XIV's rule without alteration. The Parliament of Paris was not a representative legislature in the modern sense. It was a sovereign court whose magistrates registered royal edicts. Yet the ability to issue remonstrances before registration gave those magistrates a formal means of delaying, criticizing, and negotiating over royal legislation. Orléans' bargain with the Parliament therefore solved an immediate succession problem while also reopening an institutional channel that Louis XIV had restricted. The decision would have consequences beyond the first days of the Regency. It reminded the monarchy that institutions suppressed under a strong adult king could recover affluence during a minority, especially when the government needed cooperation in managing debt, taxation, and political legitimacy. Even the ceremonial movement of the court reflected the transition. Versailles remained the great monument of the previous reign, But the young Louis XV's move toward Paris placed the child king closer to the capital and to the institutions that had just helped determine the regency. The geography of government itself shifted as the Sun King's personal court gave way to a more provisional political order. Yet even as Philip V consolidated his rule over a centralized Spanish kingdom, a far more profound and personal tragedy was unfolding at the heart of the Bourbon dynasty itself. Between 1711 and 1714, an extraordinary series of sudden deaths devastated the French royal family, completely shattering the line of succession at Versailles. For decades, the succession to the French throne had seemed remarkably secure. Behind the 72-year-old Louis XIV stood his son, Louis, the Grand Dauphin, a stable and mature heir. Behind the Grand Dauphin stood his eldest son, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, and Burgundy's two young sons. Within the span of 36 months, this entire dynastic structure collapsed. The crisis began in April 1711, when the Grand Dauphin contracted smallpox and died suddenly at the age of 49. The title of Dauphin passed to his son, the Duke of Burgundy, a devout, serious young man who was deeply influenced by the reformist ideas of Archbishop Fenelon. Burgundy and his dynamic wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, immediately became the bright future of the French court. Then, in February 1712, epidemic disease struck the court at Versailles. Contemporary doctors identified the outbreak as measles, or a severe form of malignant fever, accompanied by heavy bloodletting treatments that often worsened the patient's conditions. Marie Adélaïde fell ill first and died on February 12, 1712, at the age of 26. 6 days later, her grief-stricken husband, the Duke of Burgundy, succumbed to the same infection. The disease then spread to their two young children. The elder son, 5-year-old Louis, Duke of Brittany, who had briefly become the new Dauphin, died on March 8th. Only their youngest son, the 2-year-old Duke of Anjou, survived. Court memoirs credit his governess, Madame de Ventadour, with protecting the child from further aggressive medical treatment. The dynastic catastrophe was not yet complete. In May 1714, the king's youngest grandson, Charles, Duke of Berry, died unexpectedly at the age of 27. In 3 years, Louis XIV had lost his son, 2 of his grandsons, a granddaughter-in-law, and a great-grandson. The direct line of succession, which had appeared so robust, was reduced to a single, fragile 4-year-old orphan, the Duke of Anjou, the future Louis XV. If this young child died, the French crown would pass either to Philip V of Spain, igniting a renewed European war over the unravelling of the Utrecht renunciations, or to the king's nephew, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a man whose intellectual free-thinking and political independence made him deeply distrusted by the aging monarch. This tragic narrowing of the dynasty cast a heavy shadow over Versailles during the final year of Louis XIV's reign. The grand spectacle and military ambition that had characterized the Sun King's earlier decades yielded to a quieter, more austere atmosphere. The king was 76 years old and had endured numerous chronic health problems over the course of his long life. The court took on a sober, religious tone, reflecting the influence of Madame de Maintenon, the king's morganatic wife, who maintained a devoted presence at his side, organizing private devotions and managing access to the king's private apartments. The economic and financial condition of France in 1714 to 1715 was equally somber. Decades of continuous warfare, combined with the catastrophic famine of 1709, had left the French state heavily in debt. Royal revenues were pledged years in advance, tax collection was heavily mortgaged to private financiers, and provincial commerce was severely depressed. While the Peace of Utrecht had saved France from invasion and territorial dismemberment, it left a kingdom burdened by taxation and administrative fatigue. Alarmed by the prospect of a long royal minority under an infant king, Louis XIV turned his attention to securing the future governance of France. Under the traditional laws of the monarchy, the king's nephew, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, as the senior prince of the blood, was the natural candidate to serve as sole regent during the minority of Louis XV. But Louis XIV sought to limit Orléans' political authority during the coming minority. To check Orléans' authority, Louis XIV executed a controversial political maneuver regarding his legitimized sons. In July 1714, the king issued an edict granting the Duke of Maine and the Count of Toulouse succession rights after the legitimate princes and elevating their precedence at court. In August 1714, Louis XIV drafted his royal testament. Rather than granting full regency powers to Philippe d'Orléans, the testament established a collective council of regency. While Orléans was named president of the council, decisions were to be made by a majority vote among its members. Crucially, the testament placed the care and education of the young Louis XV, along with the command of the royal household troops, under the personal control of the Duke of Maine. This arrangement was highly controversial. Ancient French legal traditions strictly distinguished between the legitimate royal line and legitimized offspring. Aristocratic peers and the legal magistrates of the Parliament of Paris viewed the King's testament as an illegitimate exercise of royal power that violated the constitutional norms of the kingdom. It ensured that the moment Louis XIV died, a fierce political struggle over the regency would immediately erupt. Throughout the spring and summer of 1715, Louis XIV maintained his rigorous daily political routine at Versailles. At 76 years of age, having occupied the French throne for 72 years and exercised direct personal rule since 1661, the king remained the absolute focal point of European court life. Despite his advancing years and visible physical frailties, Louis continued to chair council meetings, inspect royal building projects, receive foreign ambassadors, and preside over court ceremonies. Behind this public display of royal authority, however, lay an acute awareness of dynastic vulnerability. The catastrophic deaths within the royal family between 1711 and 1714 had left the crown's survival dependent upon a single 5-year-old child. Madame de Maintenon, who had been married to the king in a private ceremony in the 1680s, remained his most constant companion, providing emotional support and coordinating a quieter, more religious domestic routine within his private apartments. Yet even her influence was carefully circumscribed by the formal institutions of the state, as the king devoted his declining energies to securing the smooth transmission of royal authority. The king's final illness began in early August 1715. Following a hunting trip on August 10th, Louis experienced severe, sharp pains in his left leg. The royal physicians initially misdiagnosed the condition as a localized attack of sciatica or severe rheumatism. Over the subsequent days, however, the pain intensified, and the king found it increasingly difficult to walk or perform his daily rituals. By mid-August, dark discolorations appeared on the king's leg. The medical team, headed by first physician Guy Crescent-Fagon, was forced to recognize that the condition was senile gangrene, a tissue necrosis caused by severe arterial vascular disease. 18th-century medicine possessed no effective treatment for advanced gangrene. External poultices, herbal infusions, and minor incisions were entirely useless against the spread of infection. By August 24th, as the discoloration moved upward toward his thigh and fever set in, the physicians and the court recognized that the king's death was imminent. Faced with his mortality, Louis XIV approached his death with the same methodical, public discipline that had characterized his long reign. In French royal tradition, the death of a monarch was not a private family event, but a sacred public ceremony of state. The king made his confession to his Jesuit confessor, Father Letellier, and received the last rites of the Catholic Church. Members of the royal family, high officers of the crown, and court courtiers were admitted to his bedchamber according to strict protocol. On August 26th, Louis XIV received his 5-year-old great-grandson and heir, the young Duke of Anjou. Memoirists of the era, including the Duke of Saint-Simon and the Marquis de Danjou, recorded the substance of the king's final words to the child who would become Louis XV. While phrasing varies across contemporary accounts, the essential message was consistent. Louis XIV advised his young successor to relieve the burdens on his people, to avoid the excessive expenditure and passion for warfare that had characterized his own long reign, and to remain devoted to God and the Church. This late-life admission reflected the heavy financial and human toll that decades of continental war had extracted from France. As the king drifted in and out of consciousness during his final days, Madame de Maintenon remained at his bedside until August 30th. Understanding that her presence at court would cease to be appropriate upon the monarch's death, she departed Versailles for the Royal School of Saint-Cyr, which she had founded, where she intended to live out her remaining years in quiet retirement. At 8:15 on the morning of September 1st, 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died at Versailles. His reign of 72 years and 110 days was, and remains, the longest documented reign of any sovereign monarch in European history. The moment the king breathed his last, his 5-year-old great-grandson instantly became King Louis XV. In accordance with French constitutional doctrine, the monarchy never died. The authority of the crown passed instantaneously to the child king without any interregnum or political vacuum. Yet while legal sovereignty resided in the child monarch, practical governing power had to be organized through a regency, setting off an immediate institutional transformation. The transfer of power was governed by the political crisis surrounding Louis XIV's royal testament. In his August 1714 will, Louis XIV had attempted to restrict the authority of his nephew, Philippe, Duke of Orléans. As the senior prince of the blood, Orléans possessed the traditional right to serve as sole regent during a royal minority. To prevent Orléans from exercising unchecked power, Louis XIV's testament established a collective council of regency, placing the young king's education, personal protection, and the command of the royal household troops under his favoured legitimized son, the Duke of Maine. On September 2, 1715, the day after Louis XIV's death, Philippe d'Orléans executed a calculated institutional move. He convened a solemn session of the Parliament of Paris, the supreme legal assembly of French magistrates and peers. Orléans presented himself as the natural, lawful defender of the young king and requested that the Parliament nullify the restrictive clauses of Louis XIV's testament. Orléans argued that a divided regency council would create administrative paralysis at a time when France required decisive governance to handle its mounting public debt and diplomatic obligations. In exchange for setting aside Louis XIV's testament and appointing Orléans as sole regent with full executive power, the Duke offered the Parliament a major political concession. He restored their historic right of remonstrance. This right, which Louis XIV had strictly suppressed decades earlier, allowed the Parliament to formally object to royal edicts before they were registered into law. The Parliament of Paris quickly accepted this institutional transaction. By judicial decree, the magistrates annulled the restrictive provisions of Louis XIV's testament, stripped the Duke of Maine of his military command, and confirmed Philippe, Duke of Orléans, as sole regent of France with full authority to direct the state. The establishment of the regency marked an immediate change in the political tone and structure of French government. The 5-year-old Louis XV was moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, shifting the political centre of gravity away from the magnificent court of the late Sun King and back to the capital. To address the state's severe financial crisis, Philippe d'Orléans introduced an experimental system of conciliar administration known as the polysynody. The traditional secretariats of state were replaced by specialized councils composed of high noblemen and experienced administrators overseeing foreign affairs, war, finance, marine, and internal affairs. While this system proved cumbersome and was largely abandoned within a few years, it reflected a conscious effort to move away from the rigid autocracy of Louis XIV's later years. Above all, the regency inherited a kingdom burdened by a staggering public debt, with annual interest payments exceeding state revenues. To avoid bankruptcy and rebuilding the nation's credit, the regent recognized that France required prolonged international peace. Consequently, Orléans made the maintenance of the Utrecht balance of power the cornerstone of French foreign policy, aligning French diplomatic interests with Great Britain to preserve the European settlement. With the death of Louis XIV, an extraordinary political era came to its close. Having ascended the throne in 1643 during the 30 Years' War and assumed personal control of the government in 1661, Louis XIV had defined the political, cultural, and military landscape of Europe for over half a century. For the vast majority of Europeans living in 1715, France had never known another monarch. What survived him was a formidable, centralized administrative state. Louis XIV had successfully broken the independent military power of the feudal nobility, established centralized royal administration through provincial intendants, and created a standing professional army that set the standard for continental powers. Versailles stood as a permanent architectural monument to absolute monarchy, while a French Bourbon king sat securely on the throne of Spain. Yet the costs of this grandeur were immense. 50 years of almost continuous continental warfare had exhausted the French treasury, impoverished rural provinces, and created a structural fiscal deficit that would plague the old regime throughout the 18th century. The unchecked strategic ambitions that had once aimed at European hegemony had been halted and constrained by the Grand Alliance at Blenheim, Ramillies, Turin, and Malplaquet, and ultimately resolved at Utrecht. France remained a major military and cultural power, but it was no longer an unchecked dominant state capable of dictating terms to the rest of the continent. As the Grand Court of Versailles fell quiet and authority passed to a 5-year-old child and a regent in Paris, the peace negotiated at Utrecht faced its first real test: whether a European equilibrium built on exhaustion and paper treaties could endure without the overwhelming presence of the Sun King. When the smoke of 12 years of continental war cleared in 1715, Europe presented an altered political landscape. The struggle over the Spanish inheritance had redrawn borders, exhausted national treasuries, and transformed the relationships among the European powers. France remained a major military and cultural power, but the settlement constrained the expansionist ambitions that had defined much of Louis XIV's earlier reign. The kingdom was financially exhausted, heavily in debt, and entering a delicate royal minority. Spain retained its territorial integrity and vast American empire under Philip V, but it had been stripped of its European possessions in Italy and the Low Countries. Furthermore, the French and Spanish crowns were formally separated by international law, ending the spectre of a unified Bourbon Empire. The Austrian Habsburgs acquired a European land empire, taking possession of the former Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. Yet this expansion brought complex administrative responsibilities and defense obligations that stretched Vienna's financial and military capacities. The Dutch Republic obtained its long-sought fortress barrier against French invasion, but the financial strain of the war had permanently altered its relative standing, leaving maritime and commercial dominance to Great Britain. Savoy and Prussia had elevated their international status, securing royal crowns and territorial additions that set them on trajectories toward becoming major regional players in European politics. The central diplomatic concept that emerged from this conflict was the idea of a European balance of power, a justum potentiae equilibrium. Peace was not achieved by the total military destruction of a rival or by enforcing unconditional surrender. Instead, diplomats at Utrecht, Rastatt, and Baden demonstrated a system of international relations in which stability was constructed through partition, redistribution, and legal constraint. Dynastic claims were separated from territorial ownership. Strategic fortresses were reassigned to act as defensive buffers. Commercial rights and naval outposts were redistributed to ensure that no single power could control both the land and sea routes of Europe. At the center of this system lay a pragmatic compromise. European coalitions had spent over a decade fighting to prevent a Bourbon prince from ascending the Spanish throne. The final peace left Philip V in Madrid, but it surrounded his kingdom with strategic checks and balances. The balance of power was not a guarantee of permanent peace, but an agreement that future competition would be managed within an international state system. Great Britain emerged from the war as a primary beneficiary of this system. By acquiring Gibraltar and Minorca, the Royal Navy secured permanent strategic bases in the Mediterranean. In North America, the acquisition of Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia expanded the British Atlantic Empire. Crucially, Britain had demonstrated that state financial architecture could function as a primary instrument of geopolitical power. The integration of the Bank of England, the national debt, and parliamentary credit allowed London to raise unprecedented capital, fund large expeditionary forces, and subsidize continental allies without collapsing state finances. This financial system provided the foundation for Britain's expanding global power throughout the 18th century. Yet the same peace that established dynamic balance among European monarchies institutionalized systems of deep human exploitation. Through the acquisition of the Asiento, the British state and its investors embedded human captivity directly into public finance. The treaty guaranteed the forced transportation and sale of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans into Spanish-American ports. In the diplomatic halls of Utrecht, the lives of human beings were treated as commercial assets to be negotiated alongside boundary lines and duty tariffs. For those subject to forced migration and lifelong enslavement, European treaty diplomacy meant the expansion of legal, state-backed bondage. Beyond the plantation colonies and formal trade routes, the sudden end of the war created unexpected disruption across the Atlantic Ocean. For over 12 years, European governments had commissioned thousands of privateers to prey upon enemy merchant shipping. When the treaties were ratified, governments cancelled letters of marque, naval fleets demobilized, and wartime maritime employment vanished. Thousands of experienced sailors, privateers, and naval veterans suddenly found themselves stranded in Atlantic ports from London and Bristol to Kingston, Port Royal, and Nassau. Possessing specialized maritime skills in a period when wartime privateering opportunities had sharply contracted, some turned their training against commerce itself. The influx of demobilized mariners into the Caribbean and Atlantic sea lanes became one important contributing condition in the period known as the Golden Age of piracy. Men who had spent years hunting Spanish or French vessels under royal commissions continued to operate independently, transforming former privateering outposts like New Providence in the Bahamas into pirate strongholds. The peace signed by diplomats in Europe set loose forces that would disrupt Atlantic commerce for another decade. When viewed across its vast geography, the War of the Spanish Succession was a conflict that touched millions of human lives. It was experienced by soldiers marching across Flanders and Spain, civilians facing requisition and winter famine, taxpayers carrying heavy state debts, sailors navigating Atlantic waters, diplomats bargaining over treaties, and enslaved people forced into the hold of slave ships. The peace therefore changed the hierarchy of European power without producing a simple winner and loser. France had been checked, but not destroyed. Spain had lost important European possessions, but the Bourbon monarchy remained in Madrid and the Spanish-American Empire remained vast. Austria had gained territory, but not the Spanish crown for which it had fought. The Dutch Republic obtained the barrier it had sought, yet carried a heavy financial burden. Britain gained strategic positions, commercial opportunities, and an enhanced ability to finance war, but it also inherited new responsibilities and new points of friction across the Atlantic and Mediterranean. What mattered most was that the war had demonstrated several different kinds of power at once. Armies still mattered, fortresses still mattered, naval bases mattered, but so did credit. A government able to borrow reliably could keep soldiers in the field longer, subsidize allies, replace ships, and survive temporary reverses. The struggle had shown that finance was not merely something that happened behind a war. Finance was part of the war itself. Britain's funded debt and parliamentary taxation would become increasingly important to its 18th-century power, but the lesson was broader than Britain. Every major participant emerged from the conflict aware that prolonged warfare required institutions capable of turning future revenue into present military strength. That capacity could extend the state's reach, but it could also burden generations who had never voted for, planned, or fought the original war. The same duality appeared in the language of balance. To diplomats, balance of power offered a way to prevent one dynasty from dominating the continent. To ordinary people, however, the mechanisms that maintained that balance could mean taxes, conscription, requisitions, blockades, and another campaign whenever the equilibrium seemed threatened. The settlement reduced one danger while leaving intact the competitive state system that had produced it. There was also no single European peace when viewed from the Atlantic. Commercial rivalry remained intense. The boundaries of imperial possessions remained disputed. Indigenous nations continued to defend territories that European treaties treated as transferable. The Asiento expanded Britain's formal participation in the trafficking of enslaved Africans, even as European governments congratulated themselves on having restored order. The language of peace could therefore conceal radically different experiences depending on where a person stood within the imperial system. And then there were the sailors. For years, privateering had blurred the line between commerce and war. Governments issued commissions allowing privately owned vessels to attack enemy shipping. Investors financed voyages in expectation of prize money. Captains and crews learned how to pursue merchantmen, navigate dangerous waters, divide captured cargo, and operate far from close supervision. War had created an Atlantic labor market for organized maritime violence. Peace abruptly reduced that market. Naval establishments contracted from wartime levels. Letters of marque lost their legal purpose. Merchant traffic resumed under new rules, and men who had spent years in armed vessels had to find places in a peacetime economy. Most did not become pirates. Many returned to merchant service, fishing, dock work, naval employment, or other trades. But for a minority, the skills and habits of wartime raiding could be redirected outside the law. In the Bahamas and elsewhere in the Caribbean, weak local authority, busy shipping routes, and the movement of experienced seamen created conditions in which piracy could flourish. The great pirate surge of the years after the War of the Spanish Succession had many causes, and Utrecht did not create piracy by treaty. But the end of a long maritime war released people, ships, weapons, and experience into an Atlantic world where legal and illegal commerce often existed uncomfortably close together. That is one of the quieter lessons of demobilization. Ending a war does not instantly return society to the condition that existed before the fighting began. Armies must be reduced, sailors must find employment, creditors must be paid, disabled veterans return to communities, widows and families live with losses that treaties cannot reverse. Fortifications remain standing, weapons remain in circulation, skills learned for war do not disappear because diplomats have exchanged ratifications. The same was true in France after the Great Frost and the final campaigns. Fields could be replanted, but lost family members did not return. A treasury could resume ordinary administration, but debts accumulated over decades remained. A child could inherit the crown, but the political system surrounding him had been shaped by the extraordinary reign that had just ended. So the settlement of Utrecht was both an ending and a rearrangement. It ended the immediate struggle over the Spanish succession. It did not end competition among the states that had fought it. It restrained the possibility of a union between the French and Spanish crowns. It did not prevent future wars between Bourbon and Habsburg powers. It recognized boundaries and privileges. It did not make those boundaries undisputed. That is why the peace endured not as a perfect solution, but as a workable one. After years in which every side had pursued something larger, the settlement asked each government to accept less than complete victory. France accepted territorial and commercial concessions. Britain accepted Philip V in Spain. Austria accepted that it would not possess Madrid or the Spanish-American Empire. The Dutch accepted a security arrangement that came with continuing costs. Compromise was not a sign that the war had been meaningless. It was the mechanism by which the war could finally stop. And slowly, the machinery of conflict began to change its rhythm. Orders that once directed regiments towards sieges now directed garrisons to evacuate or take possession. Ships that had hunted prizes carried ordinary cargo again. Diplomats who had spent years exchanging demands turned to the smaller disputes created by the settlement they had just completed. Governments calculated interest, reorganized ministries, and tried to recover enough revenue to meet the obligations left behind. For the people who had lived through the Great Frost, Malplaquet, the sieges, the frontier raids, the taxes, and the shortages, peace did not arrive as an abstract principle. It arrived in the possibility that another harvest might be gathered without an army requisitioning it, that a son might not be taken for another campaign, that a merchant vessel might cross a familiar route without searching the horizon for an enemy's sail. Those possibilities were fragile. Europe would fight again. The 18th century was not an age of uninterrupted peace, but in 1715, after a war that had seemed capable of continuing indefinitely, the guns had largely fallen silent. The old king was gone. The child king slept under the protection of a regency. The diplomats had returned home. The treaties remained, and for a little while that was enough. Behind the territorial maps and legal declarations lay a world reshaped by years of attrition and compromise. Now, the long conflict was over. We began 6 years earlier in the dark, frozen winter of 1709, in a kingdom facing famine, bankruptcy, and military collapse. In the cold halls of Versailles, an aging king had offered his plate to be melted down for coin, while armies fought in the mud of Malplaquet. By 1715, the Sun King was dead, the grand coalitions had dispersed, and the world had moved on. Historical eras rarely close with a single dramatic flourish. They fade quietly as the momentum of conflict slows down. The treaties are signed and filed away in iron chests. The ink dries on parchment declarations. The great armies break camp and march home along dusty roads. Soldiers lay down their muskets and return to fields and workshops. In the harbours, Warships drop their heavy anchors, sails are furled, and the sea returns to silence. The council chambers and grand galleries empty. The candles burn down in the chandeliers of Versailles and Westminster. Borders are drawn onto paper maps, defining where one empire ends and another begins. 5-year-old children inherit ancient crowns, and across Europe and the Atlantic, ordinary people turn back to the quiet, daily rhythms of life. The balance was preserved, the long war was finished, and the night has finally come.